The American Civil War was not only a clash of armies, but a clash of destinies, a conflict that carried within it the fate of a nation still young and uncertain. In our timeline, the Union prevailed, the Confederacy collapsed, and the United States remained whole. Yet history is not written in stone. It is a river that could have branched into many channels, and in one of those channels, the South emerged victorious. Imagine for a moment a world where the Union lines crumbled at critical battles, where European powers whispered encouragement into Confederate ears, and where political fractures in the North turned determination into exhaustion. The South could have secured independence, not necessarily by conquering the North, but by forcing it to the negotiating table. If Washington had tired of endless bloodshed, and if public pressure demanded peace, the Confederacy might have been recognized as a sovereign nation. This alternate victory would have altered the very soul of America. In our reality, the war gave birth to a stronger central identity, the idea that the United States was a single, indivisible nation. But if the South had triumphed, America would fracture into two republics, standing side by side, two competing visions of liberty, one rooted in industrial expansion and the other clinging to agricultural tradition. The path to such a Southern triumph would hinge on two critical variables: the timing of the peace and the willingness of foreign nations to legitimize the Confederacy. If Britain or France, dependent on Southern cotton, had chosen to intervene, diplomatic recognition could have forced the Union to relent. In this version of history, the South does not need to march on New York or capture Washington. It simply needs to endure, to bleed the Union until compromise seems the lesser evil. Once independence is secured, the early years of the Confederate States of America would be marked by fragile confidence. The South was built on the profits of cotton and the institution of slavery. Its leaders believed they had defended a noble way of life. They would celebrate victory as proof that their society could stand against the industrial might of the North. But beneath the pride, there would be uncertainty. Could an economy tied to enslaved labor survive in a world increasingly hostile to such practices? In Europe, abolitionist movements were rising in moral strength. Britain, though dependent on cotton, had already outlawed slavery. France, too, presented itself as a modern liberal power. International pressure would not vanish, and the Confederacy would find itself caught between its victory at home and its vulnerability abroad. Recognition might have come with strings attached: whispers of reform, threats of boycott, demands to end the trade in human beings. At the same time, the Union itself would be transformed by defeat. Lincoln, remembered as the man who lost half the nation, might not even finish his term, perhaps forced from office by despairing politicians and angry citizens. The capital could be relocated northward, closer to the centers of industrial power. Maybe Philadelphia, maybe New York, a symbol that the Union was turning away from its failed compromise with the South. The North, wounded but not broken, would lick its wounds and rebuild. Factories would still hum, immigrants would still pour into cities, and resentment would linger like a slow-burning fire. The idea of a second war would never be far from thought. Both nations would remain in uneasy tension, tied together by trade, yet divided by ideology. In this altered world, the map of America itself would appear different. Instead of one nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, two competing flags would flutter over the continent. The Confederacy, with its ambitions for expansion southward into Mexico or the Caribbean, and the Union seeking to secure the West before its rival could claim it. Conflict would simmer in borderlands and territories. Settlers loyal to each side would clash. Militias would rise, and the frontier would become a stage for endless rivalry. The question that shadows every discussion of a Confederate victory is slavery. It was not simply an institution, but the foundation of Southern wealth and identity. It was written into the Confederate Constitution, defended in speeches, and protected by those who saw it as the cornerstone of their independence. If the South had won the Civil War, slavery would not have ended in 1865, as it did in our world. Instead, it would stretch on, lingering like a dark shadow over the young Confederacy. Yet slavery could not survive forever. The world beyond southern borders was moving against it. Britain had abolished it decades before and prided itself on moral superiority. France, too, spoke of liberty, even as it built its empire. Both nations might recognize the Confederacy, but they would do so uneasily. Pressure would mount with each passing year. Boycotts could strangle Southern cotton exports, markets could dry up, and diplomatic isolation could turn victory into slow decline. The Confederacy would find itself at a crossroads: cling to slavery and risk being cut off from the world, or gradually yield and search for another foundation of survival. Perhaps in this alternate path, the leaders of Richmond would attempt gradual emancipation, not from moral conviction, but from cold economic necessity. They might devise systems of indenture or long apprenticeships, replacing chains with contracts while keeping power in white hands. The transition would be slow, bitter, and filled with violence. Within its borders, the South would face its own turmoil. Half of its population was enslaved or recently freed. Millions of black men and women who longed for freedom and equality. Victory on the battlefield would not silence them. Rebellions would smolder. Secret networks would spread, and resistance would manifest in ways both open and hidden. Just as the North had dealt with labor strikes and immigrant unrest, the Confederacy would face constant waves of unrest from those denied justice. In response, Southern leaders might build a state that resembled apartheid, a government that claimed independence and liberty while denying both to nearly half its people. Segregation laws could appear decades earlier. Paramilitary groups would enforce white dominance, and politics would be carefully arranged to ensure black citizens remained voiceless. The Confederacy would survive, but only by chaining itself to a system of fear and oppression. Meanwhile, in the Union, the story would unfold differently. Northern politics would be shaken to their core. The Republican Party, branded as the party that lost the nation, could fracture. New coalitions would rise, promising strength, vengeance, and industrial growth. The North would still attract waves of immigrants from Europe, its cities would swell with factories, its railroads would continue pushing westward. The idea of manifest destiny would not vanish. Instead, it would burn with new urgency. The Union would look west as its frontier, determined to build a continental empire even if the South had stolen its southern half. This divergence would create two competing Americas: the Union looking outward across the plains and mountains, the Confederacy glancing south toward Mexico and the Caribbean. Both hungry for expansion, both unwilling to let the other grow unchecked. The Mississippi River would become not only a natural border, but a lifeline of trade, contested by tariffs, guarded by forts, and shadowed by rival gunboats. The West would become a theater of conflict. Settlers loyal to the Union clashing with settlers loyal to the Confederacy. Kansas might again descend into chaos. Territories like New Mexico and Arizona would be battlegrounds of influence. Native nations might exploit the division, playing one power against the other. The map of the continent would be drawn and redrawn in blood. Internationally, the existence of two Americas would shift global power. In our timeline, the United States rose united into the 20th century as a giant, able to challenge European empires. But in this alternate world, the Union and Confederacy weaken one another. Europe retains dominance. Britain continues to control the seas without challenge. France and Spain may see opportunities to reclaim influence in the Americas. Even Germany and Italy, newly unified, might look west with ambition. In such a world, the Monroe Doctrine would ring hollow. Instead of one America warning Europe to stay away, two Americas would bicker while European fleets hover offshore. Cuba might remain in Spanish hands longer. The Caribbean might become a chessboard of colonial powers once more. The Confederacy, with its ties to slavery, might even ally itself with fading monarchies, while the Union leans toward industrial Europe. All of this paints a picture of tension, rivalry, and uneasy survival. The South may have won the war, but what it inherited was not peace. It inherited endless struggles, both within and without. It gained independence, but also isolation. It secured pride, but at the cost of legitimacy. The Confederacy was never destined to stand easily in the modern world, and in this alternate history, the price of victory may prove heavier than the cost of defeat. As decades pass after a Confederate victory, the question is not only whether the South can maintain slavery or manage its fragile independence, but whether it can transform itself into a lasting power. History tells us that nations built on rigid systems eventually must bend or break. The Confederacy would face this reality in every aspect of its existence. Economically, the South had wealth, but that wealth was narrow. Cotton and tobacco filled ships bound for Europe. Yet the world does not stand still. New suppliers like India and Egypt were rising. Industrial powers wanted reliable markets, not fragile plantations. If the Confederacy clung only to agriculture, it would soon find itself vulnerable, its economy unable to match the scale of the Union factories or the technological revolutions sweeping across Europe. The South might attempt to industrialize, but industrialization requires more than ambition. It requires capital, infrastructure, and above all, social transformation. In our timeline, slavery was a system that discouraged innovation. Why invest in machines when forced labor was plentiful? In a victorious Confederacy, this logic would endure for years, leaving them lagging behind. Eventually, necessity might force change, perhaps railroads spreading through Richmond and Atlanta, perhaps ironworks in Alabama, perhaps shipyards in New Orleans. Yet all of it would be a race against decline. The Union, meanwhile, would surge forward, driven by immigration, capital, and restless ambition. Its population would dwarf the South. Its industries would multiply. Its cities would tower. Defeat in the Civil War would not extinguish its fire. Instead, it might feed a hunger to prove its strength. Northern newspapers would thunder about revenge. Northern politicians would demand preparation. The Union would become a giant in waiting, determined to outgrow and outlast its rival. Politically, the two nations would remain wary neighbors, their governments constantly measuring each other's strength. The Confederacy could drift toward authoritarianism, power concentrated in the hands of planters and elites determined to protect their fragile society. Elections might exist, but dissent would be silenced. In contrast, the Union would struggle with its own identity, torn between democracy and a rising industrial oligarchy. Yet even fractured, the Union would appear more modern and more capable of adapting to the winds of change. On the world stage, the presence of two Americas would open opportunities for foreign powers. Britain could play mediator between Union and Confederacy, securing trade with both. France might look for allies in the Caribbean or Mexico. Spain might cling more tightly to Cuba and Puerto Rico. Without a single dominant United States to enforce its will, the Americas would become a field of competition once more, and the dream of hemispheric independence would be delayed. The Confederacy itself might pursue expansionist dreams. Leaders had spoken of pushing south into Mexico or creating new slave-holding colonies in the Caribbean. In this alternate history, victory might embolden them to try. Mexico, fractured by internal strife, could become a tempting target. Cuba, coveted for its sugar plantations, could draw Confederate interest. Small expeditions might even set sail, but each ambition would collide with resistance, from European navies, from local populations, and from the Union, determined not to let its rival grow unchecked. Within its borders, the Confederacy would also struggle with unity. Not all Southerners were wealthy planters. Many were poor whites who fought for pride and survival, but gained little from victory. In time, resentment could grow, class tensions could flare, and populist movements could challenge the planter aristocracy. The presence of a massive black population, whether enslaved or freed, would only deepen the instability. Rebellions would erupt, laws would tighten, violence would become a permanent feature of Confederate society. This fragile balance could spark internal fractures, states asserting their own sovereignty against Richmond, secession within a secession. Just as they had once broken away from the Union, they might one day threaten to break away from one another. A Confederacy born from division would always carry the seeds of more division. The Union, by contrast, would present a different story. Wounded pride fueling unity, expansion westward accelerating, California and the Pacific coast tied tightly to northern rails and ports. The Union would stretch its influence toward Asia, building trade across the Pacific, while the Confederacy remained locked in its southern struggle. By the dawn of the 20th century, one America would stride into modernity, the other limping behind. In the cultural imagination, the meaning of America itself would fracture. In our timeline, the Civil War cemented the idea of a single American nation, but here there would be two competing myths. The Union telling its citizens they represented progress, liberty, and industry. The Confederacy telling its people they defended honor, tradition, and independence. Two nations claiming to embody the true spirit of 1776. Two identities forever at odds. As the 19th century gives way to the 20th, the two Americas stand side by side, yet far apart. The Union surging forward into the industrial age, the Confederacy struggling to maintain its fragile identity. The world watches them both and wonders which path will prevail. The Confederacy at first celebrates its survival. Parades in Richmond honor the fallen, speeches proclaim destiny fulfilled, but beneath the banners lie questions of stability. Foreign recognition may have come grudgingly, Britain and France valuing trade over morality, yet their patience is not endless. Each year, abolitionist voices grow louder. Each year the pressure mounts. The South must adapt or face isolation. Perhaps slavery endures longer than in our world. Perhaps it transforms into systems of sharecropping or debt peonage. Perhaps the names change, but the inequality remains. The Confederacy clings to white supremacy as the core of its politics. Laws are written to silence black voices. Militias rise to enforce obedience. Terror becomes a tool of state. This new nation survives, but only through repression. Meanwhile, the Union does not fade into weakness. Defeat hardens it, like iron in the forge. Northern leaders vow that the mistake of division will never be repeated. They push westward. They industrialize at a furious pace. They welcome immigrants to fuel factories and armies. In this alternate future, the Union becomes not only a rival to the Confederacy, but its inevitable challenger. Global powers exploit this rivalry. Britain plays balance, trading with both, but ensuring neither grows too strong. France eyes Mexico with renewed interest. Germany and Italy, newly unified, test their strength on the seas. The Americas no longer stand apart from Europe. They remain entangled, their destiny shaped not only by their own struggles, but by foreign designs. By the dawn of the 20th century, tensions boil once again. The Confederacy seeks to expand, whispering of Cuba, dreaming of Mexico, promising its citizens new lands. The Union responds with its own ambitions, securing the Pacific, building a navy, dreaming of empire. The two rivals circle each other like predators sharing the same territory. Inside the Confederacy, unrest grows. Black citizens push for freedom, poor whites demand opportunity, divisions widen, riots erupt, governments crack down. Perhaps by the 1920s or 1930s, the Confederacy teeters between reform and collapse, some leaders urging modernization, others clinging to tradition. Unity proves fragile. The cracks in the foundation grow visible. The Union, by contrast, channels its energy into global influence. In our world, the United States emerged from the First World War as a power. In this alternate world, the Union may still reach that height, but without the South, its strength is divided. When Europe burns in war, the Union intervenes, yet the Confederacy stands apart, uncertain of where its loyalties lie. The two Americas face the world not as partners, but as rivals. The consequences ripple far beyond their borders. The idea of American unity never takes root. The notion of liberty remains fractured, democracy weakened by division. The 20th century becomes one not of American dominance, but of continued European supremacy. The world's balance of power shifts slowly, but decisively away from the New World. And yet the deeper question remains, what does it mean to be American in such a world? In our timeline, the Civil War gave the United States a renewed identity, one nation, indivisible. But here, that identity never forms. People in the Union call themselves Americans, but so do people in the Confederacy. Two flags claim the same heritage. Two nations cling to the same founding myth. The story of 1776 is no longer shared, but contested. The legacy of the Southern victory, therefore, is not only political or economic, but spiritual. It robs America of its unifying myth. It fractures the dream into competing visions, one defined by freedom and progress, the other by tradition and hierarchy. The rivalry echoes through generations, shaping culture, politics, and war. So what if the South had won the Civil War? It would not simply mean two nations on one continent. It would mean a different world, a weaker America, a stronger Europe, a fractured identity that never heals. The Confederacy would gain its independence, but at the cost of eternal struggle. The Union would rebuild and grow, but always with the shadow of defeat behind it. The world we know today would vanish, replaced by a history where the very meaning of America is divided. In the end, the Civil War in our timeline was a tragedy, yet it also forged unity. It ended slavery, though not racism. It gave the United States the foundation to grow into a global power. If the South had triumphed, those foundations would crumble. The world would be poorer for it, progress slower, freedom dimmer, and the story of America less a tale of unity and more a tale of division. So, the next time we reflect on that great conflict, we must remember that victory and defeat are not only measured on the battlefield, but in the destinies they create. The Union victory ensured one destiny. A Confederate victory would have ensured another, a darker, divided, and uncertain one. History, as we know it, might have been very different, but perhaps not for the better.